Okay, today you're going to have your first quiz. It comes straight from the lectures. Some of it will come, Stevie, it will be covered in your reading, but it comes from the lectures. So if you've been taking notes and paying attention, you should have no problem answering the questions. I'll read through these with Jaden, and then you guys can answer them as you go. All right. Christopher Columbus was born in Spain. True or false? Circle the one that you think is correct. Christopher Columbus discovered a new path to India. True or false? Christopher Columbus took 4 voyages to the New World. True or false? Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to send Christopher Columbus immediately. True or false? You can come back to it if you're not sure. Portugal really wanted to send Columbus, but didn't get to.
No.
Keep your eyes on your own paper, Jaden. The Spanish made the Indians full citizens and granted them freedom. Everyone thought slavery was a terrible thing. True or false? Number 7. Number 8. The Bible teaches that slavery is a good thing. True or false? Number 9. God is in charge of the entire universe, but allows us to make choices. True or false? Number 10. In Brazil, they speak German. True or false? Okay, short answers. You can go back and review the true and false if you need to. Short answers. Explain why the Europeans and Indians had different ideas about how to use land. Short answer can be 1 sentence. So you might say something like, the Indians wanted to build theme parks, but the Spanish thought they should build restaurants.
I read which restaurants in
Right, either one of those is true, so don't write that.
Oh, I thought I was going to get a freebie.
Okay, explain, then leave it blank. It's okay. This is a test that covers everybody's ages, and it will be graded appropriately. You can write something down, and if you don't know what to write, then don't write anything. You can write a smiley face. It will be hard to write on this tablecloth. So if you put it on your notebook, like you can flip your notebook over, there you go. That will actually be easier. So if you do it like that. Okay?
Okay, so.
Number 2. Alright, let's read number 2, Jaden. Explain the different definitions of freedom used by Europeans and Indians. Explain the different definitions of freedom used by European and Indians. Now remember, you don't have to write a huge essay. You could, but 1 sentence is good enough for a short answer. So you might say, the Indians thought freedom was growing corn, and the Spanish thought freedom was eating beets.
Can I get a freebie?
That's not the right answer. But it can be a short answer like that. And a short answer question, you don't have to go into a lot of detail. An essay question or a long answer question, right? There are 3 different types of responses that you'll get. Sometimes there's fill in the blank, true or false. Sometimes there's short answer, which is normally 1 sentence or 2 sentences. A long answer is a paragraph, and an essay is a well-developed idea with several paragraphs, a thesis and a conclusion. And if you don't know what those things are, you will learn. Okay, question 3.
Wait, I'm not there yet.
Well, we're going to go on. You can always come back. You don't have to follow along. I'm just reading the questions for Jaden. Number 3. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the world population dropped by 20%. What happened? So in the late 1400s and early 1500s, the world population dropped by about 20%. What happened? Now that's the population of the whole world dropped by about 20%. That's 1/5. That means if you went through and every 5th person you killed them, that's what happened.
And then close the computer.
Sir?
Close the computer.
When an airplane crashes, if a huge airplane crashes and 300 people die, that's 1/1,000,000th of our country. So that would be you go through our country and every 1,000,000 people you kill one person. People are sad and they mourn and there's a big tragedy when 1/1,000,000th of our population dies, and this was 1 in 5. 20% of not just a country, but the whole world's population. All right, time's up. Pass your quizzes in.
But I didn't get to answer question 3.
I only got
Then
to
you're writing too
question
much.
1.
Very quickly. You're doing like long answer. A simple sentence. That's okay. I told you it would be graded on a scale. Alright, let me have that.
Dad, I'm not done.
It's too late. Time's up. You gotta turn in what you got. Steven, time's up. Okay. Christopher Columbus was born in where?
Spain. Italy.
Genoa, Italy. Yep. Christopher Columbus discovered a new path to India? No. Christopher Columbus took 4 voyages.
Yes.
Yes. Ferdinand and Isabella sent Columbus right away.
Nope.
No.
No. Hey, nobody wrote their names on these things. Good thing I know your handwriting.
Oh, yeah.
Portugal really wanted to send Columbus.
Nah.
No, Portugal did not want to send Columbus. In fact, Columbus went to Portugal first. The Spanish made the Indians full citizens and gave them freedom.
No.
No, they made them what?
Slaves.
Slaves. Yeah, the opposite. Everyone thought slavery was a terrible thing.
No.
No.
No, apparently some people thought it was okay, or they wouldn't have enslaved the Indians. Right? The Bible teaches that slavery is a good thing.
No.
No, the opposite. God is in charge of the entire universe, but allows us to make choices.
Yes.
Yes. In Brazil, they speak German.
No.
Now, there may be some people in Brazil who speak German, but what language do they speak in Brazil as a nation?
Portuguese.
Portuguese. Why Portuguese?
Because the Portuguese settled there.
Because the Portuguese settled there. Okay. Why did the Europeans and Indians have different ideas about how to use land?
Because,
Because the Indians move around and the Europeans.
oh, why do they? Or what are their ideas?
Why? If you did what, that's okay. Right, the Indians didn't really... Hang on. Yeah, the Indians are different than the Europeans. They didn't think in terms of big farms, and the Europeans did, and so the Europeans thought that if you weren't farming, you weren't really using the land. And the Indians didn't really see it that way, right? So they had different ideas about how to use it. Explain the different definitions of freedom used by the Europeans and Indians. The Europeans thought that freedom was what?
Living in a structured society and doing your job.
Yeah, having a definite role in a structured society.
Volleyball.
And the Indians thought that freedom was what?
Doing the best for the community.
Doing whatever you wanted as
Unless
long
it
as
hurt
it
community.
as long as it helped the community and didn't hurt the community, right? So the Indians had more of an absolute freedom, and the Europeans had kind of a freedom within a structure.
I like the Indian freedom better.
Okay, so did the French. We'll talk about that today. In the late 15th and early 16th century, the world population dropped by 20%. What happened?
Smallpox
The
killed
diseases spread to the Indians because they weren't resistant to them because they had never met them before. You mentioned
There were some diseases like
And
smallpox
the
that
battles
spread.
killed lots of people.
Right, and lead poisoning. Lead poisoning killed lots of people. They were killed in battle or just killed, and also diseases. Right, so there were 90 million American Indians, and at the end of that time, there were 10 million. So 80 million people died. It's about 20% of the world population. It is the largest loss, percentage-wise. I don't know about number-wise. It is the largest loss, percentage-wise, in the history of recorded history. Right, so it is a huge deal. That's a big, big, bad thing.
Dad, do you have to write all of that?
Yes, these are your notes. You should try to write as much of these down as possible. If you don't get all of it, it's okay. But this is where your lecture comes from. And so if you write all of these things down, you will have everything that will be on the tests and the quizzes. Right? But to answer essay questions, you're going to need more than your notes. You're going to have to
Does this go from
understand.
or
We're about to go through it. We're about to go through it. Okay? So we've been talking about Spain. Mostly we've been talking about Spain in Central and South America, but now we're talking about somebody who actually went up through North America and the United States. Mostly Spain is down around Florida and along the coast over through Texas. And then there's this guy, his name is Juan Cabrillo. Juan Cabrillo went up to the northwest, and he went up like along California and Idaho and Oregon and Washington, and he went up that direction. He didn't go quite as far north as Washington, Washington State, but he goes all along the west coast, and so that's why California and Texas and other areas like that will be Spanish territory, was because in the 1530s and 1540s, a man named Juan Cabrillo went and he explored the Pacific Northwest. Okay, so we talked a little last time that while he is doing this, they are meeting more and more American Indian groups, more and more tribes. They're finding new people. But the Catholic Church, remember last time we talked about the different popes? The popes decided that North American slavery, not such a good thing. And when we say North American slavery, what do we mean?
we mean that thinking Indians were slaves?
Native American slaves, right? You can't have slaves from North America. They decided that having Native American slaves or Indian slaves,
Was evil.
slaves from North America was not a good thing. You couldn't do it. So instead of getting their slaves from the people that they were conquering, and you can understand why, right? Because the Catholic Church looks and they see 80 million people dying, and they're like, we got to stop. This is bad. So they say no more American Indian slaves, and the Roman Catholic Church does that. That's a good thing. And they say, no, it has to stop. But what did they say about the slaves from Africa?
All right, go ahead. Explain.
They didn't say anything. They didn't say anything.
Take those.
Right? They didn't say you can't do those. Now, if the Roman Catholic Church had said, first of all, we have to understand, first of all, the Roman Catholic Church is really not responsible for the decisions that the nations make. Right? They're not completely free of guilt. Because they should have said what?
No slaves at all.
No slaves at all. But that's looking back. You know, people have learned, and we've changed the way that we think, and we've actually changed to think more like the Bible. But in the time that we're talking about, in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries,
They were still learning.
people were still learning. It's not an excuse for doing something horrible and terrible like slavery. But they thought differently. And so when you go back and you look, it's very difficult to pass judgment on people who live in a different time because you think about things in a completely different way than they did. For example, you don't think the kingdom of God only exists where a flag is that is a Christian country. But they did. They thought in order for the kingdom of God to spread, they had to go stick their flag in the dirt somewhere. And it was not until the Spanish flag was driven into the ground in Texas that Texas was part of the kingdom of God. Well, what happens if the Native Americans come and take back the spot where they had their flag?
They
You have to go take it back.
Well, the kingdom of God isn't there anymore. Right? That's why it was such a big deal in Columbus's mind to go retake Jerusalem. That's why he wanted to go have another crusade, is because in order for the kingdom of God to exist in Jerusalem, a flag had to be flying there that belonged to Christians. And it's not until the flag flying is a Christian flag from some nation that that kingdom of God is there. Yes?
If they put their flag there and then left and nobody Christian lived there but the flag was still there?
No, that's a way of saying that it's being ruled by a Christian nation.
Okay. So I was wondering if they'd be content, like they don't even...
No, it's not like they run somewhere and they like hide a flag in a cupboard and then run away laughing maniacally. No, it doesn't work that way. They have to be in control. And once they're in control of a territory, now the kingdom of God is there. It's a misunderstanding of what the kingdom of God was. Right? So they think differently. It doesn't make what they did right. Because there were still people who said, hey, we can't do this. It just means that we can understand why they made the decisions that they did. Right? It's not necessarily our job as historians to judge what people did. It's our job as historians to try and understand why they did it. And they had some misunderstandings. But when you know where they were coming from, what they do, you can at least see and understand why they did it. And that helps us to not make the same mistakes. Okay, so 80 million American Indians died. Again, that was 20% of the world's population. This is the greatest percentage loss of human life in recorded history. The greatest percentage loss of human life in recorded history. You cannot let that escape your notice. Right? We've talked about this a lot. Maybe there's going to be, like, I don't know, an essay question or a test about it or something. But when 80 million people die, first of all, that's a huge number. That's more than died in World War II.
A lot more.
A lot more than died in World War II. And 20% of the world's population. If there was a war where 20% of the world's population died, the war would stop. Because everybody would say, this is stupid, we have to stop. Well, they killed 20% of the world's population before they realized, oh, hey, we should not do this anymore. And even then, when they decided, hey, we should stop, they didn't mean we should let the Indians be free and let them live how they were, and we'll live how we want, and we'll try and live peacefully. They meant we'll stop trying to kill them.
Yeah.
Right? They're still going to be, at the bottom of our culture. We're taking over. They're going to be the bottom. They'll be the servants. They'll be those types of things. But we just won't. We'll stop trying to kill them. So 20% of the world's population died. But you have to understand. At this time, that's not good for your pencil or the tablecloth. At this time, they tried to convert the Indians to Christianity. And if they refused to convert, then they became an enemy not just of God, but of the state. Because Spain was a Catholic country, and if you aren't Catholic, then it's not just, in their mind, you're not just wrong with God, but you are an enemy of the state. And so the state is right to punish you and hurt you and do all those kinds of things. Yes, Stevie?
I don't think Spain would have liked it very much if England had come in and made them all slaves.
The Europeans tried to fight with each other, and they tried to take over land, and these types of things did happen. In fact, in the early 1600s, there's the 30 Years' War, which is a huge religious war. While this is going on over in the New World, Europe is killing themselves also with religious wars and petty infighting between noble families. And so there's a lot of killing going on in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. There's a lot of killing going on. And so Europe is in the middle of horrible religious wars, and that's going to get us into this part when we start talking about the Pueblo Revolt. Because across Europe, people are having to decide what happens in 1517. There's a German monk by the name of Martin Luther, who lives in a place called Wittenberg, and he challenges anybody to come and debate him. He actually writes a letter to the Archbishop, to the Cardinal who lives in Mainz, and his letter is dated October 30th, 1517. And he sends it to this cardinal. Whether or not, well, we have this picture in our minds of Martin Luther boldly walking up the church steps on October 30th and taking out his paper, and it's the 31st, excuse me, and sticking it on the door, and then boom, 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 nailing it to the door, and then standing there, take that, Pope. That's really not what happened. What happened is he wrote a letter to the cardinal or archbishop in Mainz, and he listed these reasons, things that he wanted to debate. Now, were these theses, these 95 things that he wrote, nailed to church doors? Yes, but not just in Wittenberg. They were nailed to all of the church doors, because guess where people put news?
On church doors.
On church doors. And so when Martin Luther challenged people to debates, was that big news or little news?
Little news.
That was big news. Right, yeah, so it got nailed on all kinds of doors, because people were talking about it, it was being published. Everywhere that they could publish it, they were copying it and posting it, because this is a big deal. Well, that starts a huge schism, because now people are deciding, right? We are, for the very first time, we have a literate society in Europe. People are starting to read. They're publishing books. People are buying the books and periodicals and newspapers and all of these different things. And so what we're seeing is, for the very first time, people are reading and beginning to think. And they now, well, maybe the Catholic Church is wrong about some stuff. And so it starts this big division between people who agreed with Catholicism and people who disagreed with Catholicism. And in the 16th century, when nations were the kingdom of God, if you disagreed with the Catholic Church, what did that make you? An enemy of the state. An enemy of the state. Yes, Jaden. Yes, Jaden. Stevie.
Did Martin Luther actually want to, like, create a new division, or was he trying to just revise some things?
Martin Luther considered himself Catholic when he died.
So he just wanted to fix some things?
He wanted to change. He wanted the church to change to fit what he thought the Bible taught. Right? And as far as I've done lots of reading, there are people who think that he wasn't Catholic, people who think that he was, but the evidence seems to indicate that he considered himself to be part of the Catholic Church. And when he says that, he means the universal church. Whether or not he means that he is in the good graces of the Pope in Rome, he probably didn't mean that. But he did not want to start another religion, another group. He wanted the Catholic Church to change. And so he still considered himself to be Catholic in that way. But, yes.
What does that mean?
We'll talk about that later. It's not really important to the lesson today. But what we do see going on is huge divisions over religion, to the point where in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, what did they do before they sent Columbus? Who did they kick out?
Martin Luther.
Who?
Martin Luther.
No. Martin Luther's not till 1517. They kicked out who?
The Muslims.
The Muslims, right? The Moors. They kicked them out. They reestablished that Catholicism is the religion in Spain. And so now you have these people after Martin Luther who come up and say, well, you know, maybe Catholicism really isn't so good. Well, in Spain, they viewed them as the same as a Muslim. What did we do to the Muslims when they lived here?
We banished them.
We made them leave. So what are we going to do to these people who think that
We're going to kick them out.
they're going to leave too, right? And so they started something called the Inquisition. And the Inquisition would go around and they would...
Ferdinand and...
No, this is after them. They went around Spain and they determined if people were heretics or not.
I feel like people just trick around here.
No, it didn't. They determined whether or not people were heretics. If you were a heretic, you would be punished, you would be tortured until you confessed, at which point you would be humanely killed. Yes?
I'll think about it.
Okay, so what's happening over in Europe is people are being persecuted because of their religious beliefs. So over in the New World, when Spain starts sending out these monks who go and aggressively preach the gospel, good thing, right? We find new people who don't know about God. We want to teach them about God. We send people to go teach them. Good thing, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes, Zane.
Don't invite Muslims to help you in the wars.
Yeah, but that's not what we're talking
That's how
about.
they got there in the first place.
That's right. That's not what we're talking about. So the monks go, and the monks kind of take this idea of the Inquisition with them. Either you convert to Catholicism, or you're a horrible, terrible, wicked, no good enemy of the state, and you deserve whatever you get. Right? The monks were pretty brutal. Some of them. Not all of them. Some of them were pretty not so nice. Because that's kind of the idea over in Europe. And these monks are being sent by whom?
God.
The Catholic Church.
In their
Over into the New World, and the Catholic Church is fighting for its survival. Because they think the kingdom of God is political, they think the kingdom of God is national, and in order for the kingdom of God to exist, it has to have flags controlling territory and nations. And so when they go, they're trying to control territory and make people become Catholic so the kingdom of God will spread. Yes?
Doesn't Jesus say when he's about to be crucified that his kingdom isn't of this earth?
Yes.
Explicitly?
Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus basically says, "Yes, but not the way that you think of a king. My kingdom isn't of this world, otherwise my servants would
Fight me.
fight. They would fight, right. If it were an earthly kingdom, they would take up swords, we would fight you, and by the way, we would win, because it would be God's kingdom. But Jesus doesn't do that, because the kingdom of God isn't physical, it's spiritual.
And that's why the Crusades failed too, because they weren't actual spiritual battles. They were just people running around with swords.
They succeeded and failed at different ways in different times. They took Jerusalem and lost Jerusalem, and took it back and lost it. Held it for a while, lost it, and so it was not a lasting victory. We'll at least say that. So the Spanish would go through and they would kind of convert these Native Americans, and they would say convert, or basically bad things are going to happen to you. No, some people said that, but not everybody. The Spanish then, after these Native Americans, these Indians, would convert to Catholicism, they would promise them things like, oh, if you become Catholic, maybe better things will happen to you. Maybe you can fit into our culture better. And then there were these roving bands of people known as the Apaches. We're going to talk about them later. They're going to play a big role in the history of the United States. But these Apache and Cherokee and these other very nomadic tribes of people who would come down and they would raid and they would attack. And these Indians who were converting to Catholicism expected the Spanish soldiers to protect them. And they didn't. Because why would a Spaniard risk his life to save an Indian? Right? So what's happening is you're setting kind of the scene for the most successful Indian revolt in the history of the Western Hemisphere.
That was a revolt?
And it's called, in 1680, it's called the Pueblo Revolt. And what happened is the Indians got tired of getting pushed around. They got tired of being oppressed. They got tired of being mistreated by the soldiers, of mistreated by the missionaries. They got tired of being treated like they were less than human. And so they started to fight in and around the area today that is New Mexico. Right? And that's why it's called the Pueblo Revolt, because that's where the Pueblo people were from.
Move that little flat so I can see it.
Right? And so that's why it happens. So for 10 to 12 years, the Pueblo Revolt is pretty successful. Right? They pretty much drive out the Spanish. They establish their own territory. They start kind of getting things organized and set up until Spain decides that we're done. And then they send in 1692 a large army and they take the territory over again. And they were not so nice to the people that they had to reconquer. Yes, Stevie?
So what you're saying is that when the Spanish failed to protect the Indians who willingly joined them, they were setting the scenes for the Apache and Comanche to become more powerful.
No. The Apache raids were what the Spanish were not protecting them from. And when they didn't protect them, they decided, if you're not going to protect us, we're going to protect ourselves.
And that's what started
And we're also going to protect ourselves from you.
So that's what started the revolt?
That's also what started the American Revolution. The American colonists thought that the English were not doing a good enough job of protecting them.
So all you gotta do to keep your colonies is just protect them.
No, but that's important.
You gotta be
Right?
nice.
A government's job is to protect its citizens from enemies, foreign and domestic. Right? And if the government isn't going to do that, don't expect it to be a government for too long. Okay? So that's kind of what's going on with Spain up to the end of the 17th century. Right? Again, remember, century is the 17th century ends in what year? Stevie?
1700.
1700, right? The 17th century is 1601 to 1700. So when you say 17th century, you're talking about the 1600s. So 1643, what century? 17th. 1700, what century?
18th.
Nope. Stevie?
17th.
17th. 1701, which century? 18th, right? 1701 to 1800 is the 18th century.
Is that an EU or an EV?
European settlers. All right, now we're going to move into talking about the French and the Dutch empires, because in the United States, and that's who we're focusing on. We're not doing South America or Central America, really. We're focusing on the history of the United States, U.S. history. The French and the Dutch are going to be the next most important until England becomes a big player. And so what we're seeing is the French started coming over not all that long after the Spanish, but the Spanish were going south, so where did the French go? North. Right? And I remember there was that Englishman, John Cabot, who came over and started a fishing colony in Newfoundland, and that kind of died out. That was the very first English attempt. Then but Cabot was not an Englishman. He was from
Okay.
Genoa. He was from Genoa, just like Columbus. So the French start going to the northwest, and they start looking for a way around all of this land to get to where?
India.
India. But I'm still looking for India. And they go to the northwest, and they don't find it.
India
So
is really.
you can't get there. You cannot go around North America.
They
You
have
run
to go
into the
under.
thing called the North Pole. And all the ice that's up there in the Arctic Circle, you cannot go around the top of North America,
They don't have to go under.
which Ferdinand Magellan does, right? So you can't go around the top, which is what the French were trying to do. But in doing that, Samuel Champlain, and I think his name in French would be said Champlain, but in the United States today we say Champlain, right? The ch. But I don't think it makes that noise in French. We can ask some people who speak it, and maybe they'll tell us. But Samuel Champlain begins a lucrative fur trade. Because up in Canada and the Newfoundland area and all the way across the Great Lakes, over into the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley, where that kind of begins, there are a lot of animals. And so they begin to trap bears and beaver. Beaver pelts, in particular, are in very high demand because there's a fashion over in the 17th and 18th century that was kind of taking the world by storm called beaver skin hats. People wanted these hats made out of these beaver pelts. And so the French made lots and lots of money in the fur trade. So what happens is Samuel Champlain comes over, and that's why there's a Lake Champlain today. It's named after Samuel Champlain. He comes over in the end of the 17th, early 18th centuries is when we're talking about France now. The very first successful French settlements were kind of these trading posts, not really giant cities like the Spanish were establishing. So the French come over and they kind of do it in a very different way. The Spanish came and built huge cities. Right? They had an empire of cities. And the French came over and they were exploiting the land for resources like timber or mostly fur, not really looking so much for gold because there just wasn't a lot. Right? So they're getting what's available. Now the French, by 1700, they've been, listen, people have been coming over since the early 1600s. But by 1700, there are only 19,000 European settlers in all of New France. That's not very many people. How come the Spanish had loads of people, but the French only had 19,000?
Because they were having fishing stuff.
Right. They were using the New World to get resources, not using the New World
To get gold.
to establish huge cities that would mine gold and do things like that, right? So they're not really, they're not focused on industry, maybe is the way that we would think of it. They're focused more on agrarian stuff.
Oh, I thought it was agriculture.
That is agriculture.
Okay.
Okay. So then over here, New France. What kind of religion are the nobility in France largely at this point in time? Are they Catholic or Protestant?
Catholic.
They are largely Catholic. So New France is going to be what? Catholic, right? Because the kingdom of God exists where? According to their thinking.
Where they...
Wherever you have a flag, right? So the Catholic Church really only exists wherever there is a flag flown by a country that is Catholic. If countries stop flying their flags and they're Catholic, well then the kingdom of God doesn't really exist there so much. And so it's very political. So New France is going to be Catholic. Well, in France, there's this large group of people called Huguenots who were Protestants. Mostly they're Calvinists.
Huguenots. Oh, that sounds like a
Huguenots, right? Huguenots.
Who was the one who started it? Hugo?
They follow in the teaching of John Calvin. We'll get into their history later when we are doing U.S. history, not U.S. history. You don't need to know about them other than the fact that the Huguenots are the big Protestant group in France. And when France would send people over to the New World, guess who could not go?
Huguenots.
The Huguenots. If you weren't Catholic, you didn't go. If you weren't Catholic, you weren't going to New France because New France was only for Catholics. How come?
Because they wanted God's empire to be spread.
Because otherwise the kingdom of God isn't being spread. So, we can understand why they did it. They wanted to spread God's kingdom. That's a really good thing. They just didn't understand that it wasn't a physical thing. Okay, so no Huguenots allowed. In 1685, there's this thing called the Edict of Nantes, which kind of granted religious toleration. They do away with it. In 1685, over 100,000 Huguenots leave France.
So they got rid of it in 1685?
They got rid of it. The Edict of Nantes was undone in 1685. And basically what that did is it made open season on the Huguenots. You could kill them and it wasn't that big of a deal. So over 100,000 leave.
So it legalized the killing of Huguenots?
No, it didn't legalize it. It made it a statutory crime to not be Catholic again. And 100,000 people leave, but none of them get to go to the New World. So they're kicked out of France, but you can't cross the pond. Right? You don't get to go to the New World.
Unless you start your own thing.
You could finance it yourself, you could go, but France didn't send people. So the French, because they're viewing things a little bit differently than the Spanish, they're not building these huge commercial centers. And don't get confused by this in a minute, because we're about to talk about commercialism, which is not focusing on commerce, right? It's focusing on something different. So they built these huge centers that allowed them to kind of create an empire of cities. The French didn't do that. The French had lone trappers that would go out. They would have small fishing communities, very small communities. And so they didn't oppress the Indians the way that the Spanish did. Now, they weren't always treated well, right? That's not saying that the French never did anything wrong. They always did it right. But they didn't oppress the Indians in the same way that the Spanish did. They still tried to convert them to Catholicism. But when the Indians converted over to Catholicism in New France, they were treated more like human beings and more like equals than they were in New Spain, right? In the New Spanish Empire. So the French allowed the Indians to have their own kind of freedom. So you could be in New France, and if you were friendly with New France, then you kind of got to do your own thing. Right? And it's okay. Just write down the words, and whatever you don't get, if you have questions, we can talk about it later. I don't expect you to understand everything that Stevie does, all right? You're going to do this again in a few years. So the Indians are given much more freedom in New France than they were in New Spain. The French, again, are focused on the fur trade and agriculture, not commerce. Well, then you would say, well, isn't any kind of selling commerce? Yes. But when we say not commerce, we mean not commercialism. Commercialism is the idea, sometimes it's called mercantilism. It's the idea that wealth comes from the owning of natural resources like gold. The more gold you have, the wealthier you are. Is that true?
No.
It is, right? The more gold you have, the wealthier you are. It's kind of true. But people who subscribe to this theory of mercantilism, they thought there's a very limited amount of wealth in the world, and wealth only existed in the raw materials. And so they would go over to the New World, and Spain felt like it had to gather up all the gold and bring it back to Spain, because that's what made Spain wealthy. Because it wasn't in the ability of Spain to produce things, it was in the stuff that Spain owned, right? The raw materials that Spain owned. That's mercantilism. The French really didn't focus on this idea of owning materials in the New World. They focused more on what we tend to think of commerce, in the ability to produce. So they would get materials and they would use them to make things, and it was the stuff they made that brought them wealth. Like those beaver skin hats, right? They didn't ship beavers over to France. They killed the beavers and skinned them and sent the pelts over, and then the pelts were turned into hats, and the hats are what generated income, right? So they kind of had a more modern view of how things were to work. They would harvest timber, and they would send the timber over, and they didn't feel like having this timber now made us wealthy, but they would build boats. And the boat would be sold, and that would bring them money. The wood would be used to make a house, and it was sold, and that brought them money. And so they tended to view the New World not as this place where you go and steal all the resources, but they used it as a place to make it possible to produce things that brought you wealth. And so it's a slightly different view, but it winds up with two very different approaches to how they settled in the New World. Stevie?
So the French were not trying to gather up stuff. They were trying to be able to increase their productions.
Right. The French were focused on gathering things that they could use to make stuff to sell money, and the Spanish focused on just gathering things.
So instead
The
of
more stuff we've got, the wealthier we are. And the French realized that it's not stuff that makes you wealthy, but it's what you can make with the stuff. And so the French weren't so focused on gathering absolutely everything in mass.
they were just focused on gathering what they needed.
What they needed in order to make things, to make money, right? It's a much more sustainable model, and it's kind of where the direction the modern world has gone.
Are beavers edible?
Yeah, you can eat a beaver.
I was just wondering what this. I was just feeling bad for those trappers who they spend all the time hunting beavers, and then they have to go hunt for their supper too.
No, they would eat yeah, you could eat it.
But
You
Dad,
could eat the beaver.
did they use the strawberry flavor from the beaver butt back then?
No.
They didn't.
But that might be how we found out that kind of is strawberry flavored, all right? So the French, what would happen is when the French let the Indians kind of do what they wanted, they didn't force them into the rigid structure of the European society, mostly because New France wasn't rigidly structured. Right? You have all these small communities and these trappers out running through the woods. So what would happen is the French tended to adopt a similar lifestyle to the Indians. Instead of forcing the Indians to live like Europeans, the French would go over and the French wound up living like the Indians. And so it's very different. When the English came over, the English tried to tame the land and turn it into a New England. When the Spanish came over, they tried to tame the land and make it into a New Spain. When the French came over, the French were like, hey, this Indian life is pretty cool. And most of the French would wind up living more like the Indians than like the people back in Europe.
At least
And-
they appreciated.
Well,
Indians.
what would happen is a lot of the Indians then, when conflicts started, not all, but a lot of the Indians would wind up siding with the French.
Because they were more friendly.
And so that's why in the 1700s and the 1760s, you have what is called the French and Indian Wars. Because the English would be fighting mostly against the French and Indians. Because there were a few tribes that sided with England, but not very many. And the reason why the Indians sided with the French, most of them, is because the French kind of let the Indians do whatever they wanted. And the French actually lived more like the Indians. Eventually what's going to happen, though, is just the massive population that would come over in New England and New Spain would just overwhelm the native people because they lost over 90% of their population. Yes.
I just realized, is that why many Canadians speak French and are like French descendants?
Yeah, up like Montreal, Quebec, they speak French. Yeah, in fact, France has two national languages, English and French, and this is why.
Because they settled here and the English also did.
The French settled mostly in Canada and along the northern part, along the Great Lakes, and down into the Illinois and Indiana, Ohio Valley regions. Right? They came down kind of almost into New York, but not quite that far down.
So they were really northerners. They preferred the up north.
Well, they're going to be cut off by these other people called the Dutch that we're going to talk about next time. Right? So the Dutch are going to be over here settling too, at the same time that the French are going across the northern part of North America. All right, that's it for today. Any other questions?
No, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much.
This is enough notes.
If you copied everything down off the board, you've got what you need.
I got everything on the board and a little bit more.